My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about Eucatastrophe. Now I've done a video on the concept of Eucatastrophe, which I will link to below, but the basic idea, and this is a word that Tolkien coined, is that it's kind of the reverse of a catastrophe. Whereas a catastrophe is like a really bad, calamitous thing that comes out of the blue, a Eucatastrophe, with the EU meaning good, of course, from the Greek, it's the idea of a sudden turn to the better, which, as Tolkien puts it, is usually as a result of grace, not to be counted on again. And so in light of that, what I wanted to look at were the instances of Eucatastrophe in The Lord of the Rings specifically. So let's take a look at those. Now, for those of you who have not read the books but have only seen the movies, this one may come as a bit of a surprise because it's not in the movie. When Frodo and company are leaving the Shire, it's actually Frodo, Sam, and Pippin who are together, and they are at one point hiding from a Black Rider, and it's actually the second time that they hide from the Black Rider. I've actually done a video on the differences, and I'll link to that below in case you're interested in the full story. But the second time they get an encounter with the Black Rider, they all kind of hide off in the woods, and the Black Rider dismounts and actually starts walking into the woods towards Frodo. At that moment, the Black Rider suddenly stops, goes back to his horse and rides off, not in a huge hurry, but certainly not, taking his time. And at that point, they realize, oh, there's elves coming. He must have heard the elves, and that's why he ran off. Now, this is a very minor example of a Eucatastrophe, but certainly it seems to fit the theme, because obviously something bad would have happened if the Black Rider had actually gotten to Frodo, and it's rather coincidental that a bunch of elves would just happen to be coming by at just that particular moment. Although Frodo does tell the other hobbits that sometimes elves can be seen walking around in the Shire. Still, it's really interesting timing and certainly not something you would want to count on. The next major example of a Eucatastrophe comes much later in the story, and it's a bit of a double whammy because I'm counting it as the same thing, but it's the battle at Helm's Deep and the destruction of Isengard by the Ents. It's all kind of the same story coming together, just in two different places and for two different reasons. At Helm's Deep, of course, we have a relatively small contingent of the Riders of Rohan manning the Hornburg and the wall until the wall is overrun and breached, and then only the Hornburg, and it looks like all is lost when Theoden basically tells Aragorn, you know what, I'm not just going to sit here and die like a badger in a trap again. Not in the movie version, but in the book version, Theoden's a much better character, just let me tell you. Anyway, they do decide to ride out, and they sound the horn of Helm, which echoes among the mountains, makes the orcs think that there's a huge army that's about to come out of the mountains. They all ride out, and the next thing you know, the orcs are running from them, and in roughly the same time, Gandalf arrives with the men from the Battle of the Fords of Isen who had been kind of scattered, and they end up routing the orcs, who then see that, oh wait, there's a forest over here now. Where did that come from? And the orcs are like, well, which way do we go? They run for the woods, of course, because they're not really expecting, armed combat, but of course they end up all disappearing. Let's just put it that way. Nobody really wants to know what happens to those orcs. So, of course, a lot of these things all coming together at one time is very much the idea of a Eucatastrophe. If Gandalf had come, 3 hours later, he might have found a lot of dead riders and the dead Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli on the field, and there might have been no, the orcs wouldn't have had to run into the forest that sprung up overnight, seemingly. So that's certainly one aspect of it. The Ents coming to Isengard is kind of similar because the Ents don't really tend to get involved much, but then Merry and Pippin just happen to show up on Treebeard's door. Not that he has a real door, I guess, but they show up, and Treebeard kind of from there starts making moves that it's not clear that he would have taken earlier. He does say in the book, unlike in the movie, that he's been thinking about what to do about Saruman for a while, so it's entirely possible he might have done the same thing. But even in the book, he expresses some doubt as to whether they might succeed, Well, they end up waiting for the entire army to leave, and then they go in and, of course, destroy Isengard completely. And the part of this is the reason it's a Eucatastrophe. We don't learn about the destruction of Isengard in the book until after the victory at Helm's Deep and the rest of them have all come to Isengard. And for the most part, they're worried. Gandalf basically tells Theoden, just bring a few people, we won't be long. And the whole time they're kind of worried, like, shouldn't we like bring more people to Isengard? It's kind of a stronghold. But then they get there and they find it's all destroyed. So for them, it really is a Eucatastrophe because they expected to arrive and there still be garrisons of orcs and Dunlendings and Saruman, well fortified in this fortress. And they come to it and the gates are broken down and it's just a trash heap. So for them, that's where the Eucatastrophe comes in for them, because they had no notion, of the Ents even existing or anything like that. So that's why that one counts. Skipping ahead now to the Return of the King, we come to Aragorn's arrival at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, because again, this is where the book and the movie differ, although the movie even does it in a somewhat of a eucatastrophic way, but it's better in the book. It's always better in the book. Aragorn is coming up the river Anduin in the Black Fleet, and of course, the Black Fleet is supposed to be the Corsairs, and everybody knows this. Now, the way it goes in the movie is pretty, you don't even really know the ships are there until, well, they're there, and then the orcs are trying to figure out why they're not getting out of the ship, and then Aragorn jumps out, and they think, oh, it's just 3 guys, we can take them, and then the army of the dead comes out. Okay, well, that's kind of a cheap shot on Jackson's part. The army of the dead never made it that far. In the book, the way it goes down, the army of the dead helps them take the Corsair ships, but then there's all these people who had been enslaved on the Corsair ships that they were using as rowers. They basically become the new members of the fleet. So they're the new crew, plus a lot of people that Aragorn gathered up from the southern lands of Gondor. So they're now coming up the river Anduin, and they're having a really hard time because they're having to flow upstream. But towards the end of the trip, they get a wind out of the south, which is what rolls the clouds back when the Ride of the Rohirrim comes, which is in itself something of a Eucatastrophe for Gondor. But they finally come. Now, Theoden, whenever he gets killed by the Witch King, and then all of that stuff happens, Éomer comes up, sees that Theoden has died, and now he also sees that the armies of Mordor are kind of rallying after their initial retreat from the charge of the Rohirrim, and so he's kind of thinking that, all right, well, we're just going to make a desperate last, we're just going to try to kill as many as we can, and he sees the Black Fleet coming, and it tells us that Éomer sees it, and he's like, whatever, I'm going to defy these guys. And he kind of raises his sword in defiance. And it also tells us that the people in the city who can see way down the river because they're up high, they see them coming and they're all despairing, and they're trying to get everybody back into the walls before they're overwhelmed. As Éomer raises his sword, Aragorn raises the standard of the kings of Gondor, the white tree and the crown and the 7 stars. And so in the midst of holding his sword up, Éomer sees what's happening, and he's like, wait a minute, that's good news. And so that the way it all plays out in the book is much more of an interesting turn of events that you don't expect, because at this point we haven't heard from Aragorn for a while. We don't know what's happened. And so you lose that piece of the story until we hear it kind of told as backstory by Legolas and Gimli later on in the book. So when Éomer is looking out, we're looking from Éomer's perspective. We're just seeing the black ships. That's all we really know. He does his thing. They raise the standard, and suddenly it's like, aha, it's all coming together. So that's why that one's a Eucatastrophe. Now, of course, the greatest Eucatastrophe of the entire story is the destruction of the ring. Frodo manages barely, with the help of Sam, to finally make it to Mount Doom, but then he just cannot resist the ring. It's in the center of Sauron's realm. It's at the height of its power. He cannot fight the desire to take the ring anymore. It's just too much for him. So he claims the ring. Gollum, of course, followed Sam into the Crack of Doom. He ends up you know, knocking Sam to his feet, and then goes and tries to wrestle the ring from Frodo, bites his ring off. And here again, a difference between the book and the movie, for those of you who don't know. In the book, what happens, Gollum gets it, and he's so ecstatic about getting the ring back that he just starts dancing around and goes too far and topples over the edge. He doesn't have a fight with Frodo. As soon as Frodo loses the ring and his finger along with it, he basically comes to his senses again, and he's fine. He doesn't have this, like, ring-induced rage. I'm going to get my ring back. I hate that change, by the way. I'm going to do a video of things that I really hate like that eventually one day, but not for now. But anyway, the way that Smeagol completes the quest by trying to thwart it is such a Eucatastrophic moment because of the way it gets handled. I mean, he's trying to stop the entire thing, but he himself takes the ring into the fire, which is perfect because he really needed to go anyway. He wasn't going to cause any more good after that. So that is the biggest Eucatastrophe in the entire story, but it's not the last one. Now I have to talk about the Scouring of the Shire, which, if you don't know the book, then you really don't know what I'm talking about. But I've done a whole video on the Scouring of the Shire, which I will link to below so you can check it out if you don't want to be spoiled, or if you just want to learn what it is before I get into the detail. Basically, to cut a long story very short, the lots of evil men led by Saruman had basically taken over the Shire and turned it into kind of a socialist dictatorship, basically. They basically took all the food, hoarded it for themselves, and the rest of the hobbits had to get by on scraps. And I say socialist dictatorship, I don't mean to say that as to imply that Tolkien was allegorizing socialism, but that's the closest thing that you can think of, is kind of like a communist Russia type of existence, really. At any rate, the hobbits return, of course, and they eventually set things right, and the Eucatastrophe comes in when they realize a few things. First of all, I should note that the Shire had been depleted of a lot of resources. Like I said, these men had been basically taking things from the hobbits. They'd also been cutting down a lot of trees and turned it kind of into a wasteland, a really ugly wasteland. The Eucatastrophe really begins when they find that there's a whole lot of stored up food that hadn't actually been used or destroyed. And so that's the first thing that really kind of livens everybody up. The second thing is Sam, and he remembers that he got this box from Galadriel. In the movie, he doesn't get this box from Galadriel when she's giving out gifts. In the book, it's a box. He opens it, and there's basically kind of a grainy dust with one large seed or nut in it. Basically, he plants saplings everywhere, puts a grain of the whatever the dust is with each sapling everywhere he goes, trying to restore the Shire to its former state. And he plants the nut where the party tree had been, the party tree from Bilbo's birthday party at the very beginning of the story. Well, what we learn is the succeeding year apparently tried to make up for 20 with the growth of the trees, because they all sprang up really fast. And it turns out the nut was actually a Malorn seed, which is a Malorn, if you're not familiar, because I don't think they actually reference it in the movie at all, but it's this specific tree that's unique to Lothlorien. It's really only found there. It's got silvery bark and golden leaves. So, very special tree, but basically the Shire ends up even better off in some ways than it was before. Another major point that occurs is Lobelia Sackville Baggins, who had kind of been a thorn in the side of Bilbo and Frodo, had also been badly treated during the entire thing, and she actually was one of the few people that kind of stood up to all the bad things going on, despite the fact that it was her son that kind of, in some way, kind of got it all started by inviting some of Saruman's cronies in. But at any rate, she had been imprisoned and was very badly off, and Frodo took pity on her and helped her out. She gave Bag End back to Frodo because she had bought it in the actual story, which, again, my video on the trip from Bag End to Buckland, which I referenced earlier and will be in the description below, kind of tells that story a little bit. She gives Bag End back to Frodo, And then she also uses a lot of her fortune to help out hobbits who had been rendered homeless or whatnot, and that kind of ended the feud between the Baggins and the Sackville Baggins, which is a pretty big deal. I mean, it's a big deal in the world of, the Hobbit folk anyway. In the Shire, that's a big deal. Not as big a deal as defeating Sauron, of course, but it's still something. So a lot of things went on here, and it all really kind of gets summed up by this one particular line kind of at the very end. And no one was ill, and everyone was pleased, except those who had to mow the grass. So the idea being everything was so plentiful and happy the next year or two that everybody kind of forgot about all the problems. So major Eucatastrophe to end the story with. So we'll just go ahead and leave the video here. So those are instances of Eucatastrophe in the Lord of the Rings. If you think I left out any, please do put them in the comments below. And to head off any comments about the Rohirrim arriving at Gondor, I will just say I didn't really include that one because Denethor in the book and Gandalf and Pippin in the movies had actually tried to get Rohan there, so it's not like it was totally beyond expectation that they would arrive and help out. I don't think that quite qualifies as a Eucatastrophe. The timing is certainly, poignant and whatnot, but it's not really quite the same thing, I don't think. But if you do have other examples that you think I should have mentioned, please do leave them in the comments below. Or if you disagree with some of my examples, point that out as well. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. I'll link to my Patreon if you want to patronize the channel in the description below. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here, and you can find a couple of my previous videos here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.